Could I first invite Dr. Horvath to unmute and give his opening remarks? Dr. Horvath, over to you.
So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor to speak as part of this high-level panel to such a distinguished audience. And by the way, a great conference. I've already learned a lot. I'm an economist. I've just retired from UNDP, and I'm a practitioner who has followed development from various angles and many continents, including Asia and specifically China, where I lived for 3 years when I was chief economist for Asia Pacific in UNDP, and also advisor on the Belt and Road Initiative. So what I see is that today China and the US, the world's two largest economies, are in a strategic competition. And they are in that competition in a fragmented, unequal, and highly polarized world. The future path of these two countries, but I dare to say of the global economy, depends on how they approach their strategic rivalry. And a key point I'd like to leave with everyone is China can be the actor who guides this rivalry towards cooperation, away from zero-sum approaches. And of course, it needs to do so working with willing partners. And this is a very important theme that needs to be followed through. And that is the backdrop to my answer to the main question to this panel. If applied consistently, then Beijing's model of neutral mediation, development-focused partnership indeed can help. It is necessary for attaining stability in international relations, global development, trade, and investment. But it is not sufficient. China in itself, as a single country, cannot achieve this. This can only be achieved through effective global cooperation with an emphasis on global public goods. And the role of the UN has been mentioned already. It definitely has a role to play in this. Let me stop here because this is just the introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Horvath. I'd like to just pick up on one thing you said, Doctor, before moving on to the next opening remarks. What is it that makes China so well poised to be a key actor in the stabilization that we're all seeking? But aside from the obvious, its size, its economic power, what are some of the other factors involved in that statement?
It's history. Of course, China is big. No one will fall off the chair when I make this statement, and a very large part of the global economy. But beyond that, China has a unique history, which has taught it how cooperation is important. And it has, we have heard in the previous panel, made tentative steps to actually realize that potential, but it has some way to go.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Horvath. We'll perhaps come back to some of those historical factors a little bit later. Wonderful. Could I ask Ms. Naidu now to unmute and share a little bit about yourself and also some opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Karim, and thank you to the organizers for this very important, but I think very timely discussion, and my appreciation to be on such a high-level panel. I work with the Institute for Global Dialogue. It's a policy think tank based in South Africa, and we look at South African foreign policy, external relations, etc., but also in the context of the relationship that Africa has with external actors. And part of that is our engagement on China-Africa relations or Africa-China relations, and looking at its various dimensions in the context of the political, economic. And I think this discussion fits very nicely in terms of where Africa's trajectory is in China's global architecture, its engagement in terms of the African partnership, the African footprint. And to try and just then use this as a segue into my 2 or 3 very broad remarks in response to this issue around can China underwrite global stability? I think it's a very interesting point. And taking the point of departure from the previous panel discussion, I think we have to think about this in the context of what are the push and pull factors that link to China's role, both as a stabilizer, a mediator, but also a development partner, and now more importantly, a technology engager in very much part of its global ambit, but in the context of Africa as well. For me, the long and short of it, or the very quick answer is it's a very difficult role for China to pursue. Not because it does not want to pursue the role of underwriting global stability or being a stabilizer of note, because if we think about Africa, when China began its African engagements, it was very much that kind of actor, even in the period of the decolonization, the independence, the relationship with independent movements in Africa. It played that role in terms of underwriting cooperation, engagement, partnership, etc. Particularly one of the flagship projects of that was the Tazara Railway, which wasn't just about economics or about development as such, but it was about the friendship, the cooperation, and it still remains one of those very historical projects that China has reinvigorated of note in recent times. But I think the challenge that China, like every other actor now faces in the global architecture, is that we're sitting with a very uncertain, vulnerable, complex, and ambiguous global system. That the idea of the fragmentation of having a stabilizing actor or just one stabilizing actor becomes much more complex in terms of what the issue is and how you actually use your agency towards that cooperation. And I think that's the challenge we're seeing as China begins to look at capacities, the capabilities, and the distribution of resources in the global architecture. And so the idea of creating institutions that not necessarily are to just challenge the global order, but rather to provide that kind of nexus around whether it's the digital Silk Road under the BRI, whether it's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and more recently, I think, the whole global governance initiative. And then linking that to the other three initiatives, the development initiative, the civilizational initiative, and of course, the security initiative, gives us the idea that China does not want to be seen as trying to overhaul the system at its own in its own image, at its own pace. It's looking to facilitate that relationship, and it's looking to look at relations in a much more broader set, because the challenge really is what is the global conditions that need to be reset. And I think it comes back to also not becoming caught up for China, not becoming caught up in the crosswinds of being seen as an actor that is going to be replacing another actor, because that's very much, I think, nervous tick for China, because it doesn't want to get caught in the same kind of challenges, whether it's the normative dilemma, whether it's the issue of becoming a part of the issues that you now see with the US and the kind of Western liberal order, that they're beginning to find those dimensions. So I think in that way, as I come back to some of these questions in greater detail, I think the challenge for China is really how does it play that role, but doesn't get caught up in the fact that some of these issues can also come back and raise the spotlight in terms of the challenges that China may face at the domestic level, and how does it navigate those spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Naidu. It's just wonderful to have a voice from within Africa who can share some of these perspectives. I think the vast majority of what we hear about China's engagement with Africa is from non-Africans, particularly Western voices. So it's really nice to have your perspective. I do want to come back later to one of the problems with talking about China's engagement with Africa is it makes it sound like it engages with every country in the same way. The sheer volume of countries, cultures, languages, systems of governance across the continent mean that obviously it doesn't. So I'd love to maybe explore that a little bit later with you. One thing I wanted to ask you talked about the 4 global initiatives, right? Belt and Road, development, security, civilization. Of course, these are all important, and a balance of all 4 is going to be the most effective. But in your view, which one or two of these is most relevant, most important for the continent at this particular period?
For me, Karim, it's the nexus between the development as well as the civilizational and the security. Because the way I see triangular cooperation that China seeks to push forward and actually develops and defines and enacts in Africa is around the emphasis. The premium is on development, but development comes with this kind of architecture or the purview that it has to be about the securitization of human development. And at the same time, recognizing that human development or human security linked to human development is the pinnacle for China, or if not the pivot for China's understanding of what is stability, what is governance, and how do you define that. As not necessarily trying to impose a model on Africa, but trying to look at development outside of the purview of that it has to be about the first generation of human rights only, but it's about the socio-economic generation of human rights. However, I think the challenge that China does face in Africa is that when the economic kind of architecture is threatened by instability, whether it's the conflict in Sudan or the instability in the Red Sea through the Horn of Africa, or what you're seeing on the west coast of Africa, or even in Mozambique, then the challenge for China is how do you articulate that nexus between development and security, not only in the context of human security and human development for Africa, but rather your economic interests that are now threatened by instability in Africa.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you, Ms. Naidu. And this is a really nice segue actually to Professor Wang, who I'd like to invite next, because part of what you're describing there, and I know Professor Wang has got some views on this, is the language itself, right? The word security means something quite different depending on which part of the world you come from and what context you are in. So, Professor Wang, love to hear your opening remarks and a little bit about yourself as well.
Thank you. There are lots of discussions in the last panel about China's role. What more and more expectations China can play a more active role. But China hesitates to use leader or leadership because we don't like to use this maybe initiative to do something, but not leadership, because for our tradition and our culture and even power. So better understand different cultures between China and the United States, between the different traditions of China and the United States, between different capacity or power, meaning of China and the United States. So about the culture, the U.S. is a promised land to the chosen people, the God bless America. China never said that. China thinks that all the human beings are born equal, not created equal. So that's the key differences between China and the United States. We are more circular. U.S. is more religious thinking. So that's the reason have a different understanding of intervention. And also China is non-alliance, independent foreign policy, because we treat each as equal. As the Buddhism said, 众生平等, all the lives in the planet, they are equal, including animals and the human beings. It's not like I'm civilized, you are barbarians, you should rationally, it's different, understand. Secondly, the tradition, China, we are long-term of the non-interference of our foreign policy. The U.S. success of the Great Britain, the hegemonic power, and Europe colonized the world. China never colonized the world. So that's our tradition. So we are not interfering in domestic affairs. At the same time, China also don't understand so much as the UK and the US today, because we are just a newcomer of the world. Okay, so it's for a long time, thousands of years, China is inward looking. Even all on the heaven actually is in Eastern Asia, so not globally. And capacity differences between China and the United States. US is more financial power. China is a world factory, is a manufacturer power. So US need to create more crises and then to beat, and then they can increase the increased rate and make huge money for that by intervention, and even crisis is good for US in some cases. But China, because we are the manufacturer power, we need a stable situation. China rise is also with a peaceful rise because China live in a very peaceful environment. So in this regard, we need people to live there peacefully to make a more living, and then we can sell more products to them, and so-called win-win cooperation. So that's the BRI politically highlights. So for instance, now the Ukraine war, China, Europe, we are express, stopped and even suspended because of this war. China suffered a lot, and particularly our huge investment in Ukraine. So there's different model of productivity between China and the United States. And you mentioned about the narrative as cultural differences. China, we do think as the life's bond, not created. So it's not original thing like the Americans consider about. So the essence is evil, power is evil. So we need checks and balance domestically, internationally. It's not that way. China don't think that way. So China think about the human beings' essence is neutral. Either positive or negative is neutral. So it's education and the social environment change. We are more pay attention to the education. That's Confucius and the founding father of the education system of China. So we don't want to be the balance somebody, the balance of power, balance of threat or balance. We don't like that way. So we more prefer harmony among different peoples and harmonies between man and the nature and harmonies between you and yourself. So that's the Buddhism, particularly focused on you and yourself relationship. And the Taoism is more focused on you and the nature's harmony. And then the Confucianism is more focused on you and others' harmony. So that's, I think, basically differences, as I mentioned. And also about the world. We think about the world, they have their Tao. Tao is like the natural principles or law of the heaven. You really do not interfere. You cannot guarantee you're always on the right side of the history. China said whether you're on the right side or wrong side need to be tested by the history, by the people. So that's the reason we have different legitimacy understanding of power. So in today's world, it's more and more dangerous because the US cannot play that kind of a leadership role. So 2006, I published a very controversial and influential article in the Global Times that prevent the US from declining rapidly. I predict the US declining. There are 3 steps: back to Asia, back to Europe, American continent, and then back to United States. Now, actually, witness this gradual change of the US leadership in the world. So what China can do? So it's like the traditional Chinese medicine and the Western medicine. We prefer, number one, less intervention. If there is need intervention, less spillover effect, not to interfere, solve one problem and then create another new problem. So that's basically, we need a systematic, long-term, and a fundamental thinking to solve this problem. So that's the reason China have so many initiatives. That means China prefers partnership, not alliance, not intervention, less intervention. And domestically first, economic first. So that's the reason China helped Palestine. There are 9 different groups and the different parties make the reconciliation in Beijing, and also before, and Saudi and Iran make the reconciliation. And also we hope maybe Ukraine and Russia make a reconciliation and rebuild of the more sustainable and just order and sustainable order in Europe. So that's basically to answer that kind of questions. So again, thank you, and pay more attention to the Chinese culture, which is different with the United States. Pay more attention to the Chinese tradition. Pay more attention to understand the power of China is different with the United States. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Wang. And I like the analogy of Chinese medicine there, which I've used a lot myself. And you said it's about less intervention. I think it's also really about treating the root cause of the problem rather than treating the symptoms. So it'd be interesting as this conversation goes on to see what people on the panel believe are some of the root causes of the current challenges. And last but not least, I would like to invite Professor Ali to unmute and share her opening remarks.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Gift and all the co-panelists and the participants. I find I have consistent thoughts with those who have just shared their opening remarks. I think there are a few things that I would like to just contribute or add or maybe underscore. The first is echoing Dr. Horvath's comments. I think that part of what we're seeing at this present time is this real need to understand the direction of global order is moving in a direction that reflects the scientific insights that we've achieved in this last century, which is namely that there is one human species. I think genetics, anthropology have confirmed this. We have the same DNA makeup. We have a common home planet. So with these insights then come the application to our spheres of governance. How do we apply this ecological and scientific knowledge and these values-based principles to how we govern the relation between countries? And again, that's a collective question. So there are 2 points. One is this inherent oneness, and I think China has had great history and insight about this principle, I think both from the medical Chinese medicine, but also philosophically. These concepts, also the idea of removing blockages within the body to address health. So we also see evolution as well. So we've seen over time that we've moved as a humanity from family, clan, tribe, city, state to nation. That's where we are now. We are organized as nations. And we have issues and conflicts at this level because the issues we're facing now are global in nature. We have environmental pollution, which spills over. We have new technologies which need to be addressed. These can't be addressed at the national level. So now we have this challenge of how do we coordinate as a global system. And a global system inherently is one of cooperation. Just as within a federated grouping of states within a nation, there is no one state or one province or one subunit which takes precedence over the others in that federated nation. In the same way, I think what we're seeing is we need to move towards this concept that all states, as was mentioned, are equal. They comprise important components of a global body, which needs to be developed and strengthened in terms of the systems that underlie the way decisions are made. But again, this is a shared governance that needs to be developed. Another point that I'm happy to share and later we can talk about are some of the insights that China has brought to systems of mediation, conflict resolution. What are some of the values that have been brought to bear in that field? I think there's some really unique, important thoughts that have been developed, and they are quite consistent with some of the insights that we see also globally, but also there's been this unique, I think, challenge within China to really maintain those because of the large population, the limited arable land, and this need to really maintain that harmony. So there's been this cherishing of these ideals, which I think is quite wonderful. But there is also, I think, a real need for global dialogue on the values that underlie how we address conflict. What are the principles? What are the aspirations that we share, and how can we learn to have a shared language about these values? So I'm happy to address any of these and look forward to the conversation as we go.
Thank you, Professor Ali. I'm going to start actually with a question for you. Professor Ali, I want to pick up on the second to last point you made about your area of expertise is in mediation. And you've mentioned that China's insights and values that have come into this space are things that are very valuable and that others can learn from and are actually helping to enrich mediation. Could you expand on that a little bit and share what some of those insights and values are that China's bringing to the international mediation table?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So I think China has, of course, a long history of mediation. I think it goes back to ancient times. There was this idea that individuals can act as peacemakers. They're noted for their wisdom. They can help to remind parties of a common value aspiration and help bring parties to that middle ground. But as I mentioned, though, this aspiration towards reconciliation is something that we can find roots in all cultures. And perhaps the way they're expressed may be different today. But for example, if we look at the very, very far back origins of history, Abrahamic times, 2000 BC, there was this idea of keeping of covenants, fairness. Then we come to Hinduism, 1500 BC, this idea of dharma. People should act with righteousness, justice, promote nonviolence. Then we come to Judaism in 1800 BC, pursuit of shalom, this idea of peace, the use of mediation that has also been mentioned, Beit Din. Then we come to Buddhism, 500 BC, this idea of emphasizing right speech, the middle way, moderation, peace through dialogue, compassion, loving kindness. These are important virtues. Then we come to Christianity, which is emphasizing forgiveness, reconciliation. And then Islam, there was the role of Muhammad. He acted as a mediator between tribes. Also, we have philosophers, of course, Confucius. Lao Tzu has made many contributions to the idea of Wu Wei and not asserting oneself, being selfless, but also thinking of humanity, the humanity of between that exists, this idea of Ren. So then, more recent times, concepts from Baha'u'llah talk about how do these apply in the sphere of global civilization. But I think China has had a special place keeping this mediation system ongoing in different forms. And I think that it has evolved. And in fact, in the 60s, delegation of the Supreme Court, as I understand, in the US visited China and visited many of the mediation centers that were existing, and was quite inspired by that. And subsequent to that, developed a very robust, professionalized mediation system within the courts. Now all courts throughout the world have some form of mediation. This idea of reconciliation is something that's deep-rooted. But how we achieve it, what are the principles on which we achieve it? This is a conversation that we need to have more of. What are the relevant principles now that can really help bring parties together? What resonates in the heart of people that will actually have them move towards a common point of agreement? This is a conversation that I think is very important. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
You just gave us that 4,000-year timeline. At a fundamental human level, values around mediation, around selflessness, around harmony, around unity are prevalent everywhere. So I guess my question, I'm going to come back to Dr. Horvath actually on this. If that is the fundamentals of so many cultures, so many traditions, be they national or faith-related, then what are some of the barriers today that seem to make effective mediation so challenging in your view, Dr. Horvath?
A very deep question. Effective mediation and effective action needs to take into account that whatever action you take, indeed, actions you do not take, have a risk cloud around them. So very often, if you take a risky action, then you find that it backfires against you. But what most people forget is that sometimes, and current history actually shows a couple of examples, if you do not take action, the risks associated with that are actually bigger than even just trying in a reasonable way. And I think that this is something that China needs to mull over today. And we've heard earlier about the Palestinian issue. We've heard about the issue in Ukraine. Both require mediation. But let me give you two examples where I believe, and again, in economics, which is my area, where China can very usefully take action. And one has to do with trade. If you think about the rise of China and South Asia and Southeast Asia in the past 40 years, they have gained tremendously from gains from trade. By opening up and trading and focusing on comparative advantage, they have really moved ahead and have been able to gain. And the risk that I see today is that this can play out in reverse. If there are obstacles raised in front of trade, if there are blockages to trade, then if China takes an approach, okay, you block my trade, then I block your trade, and this can end up in an equilibrium that is very clearly adverse to everyone involved, and not only to China and the US, but the rest of the world as well. So trade is an area where China can act as a leader and a global balancing factor. Another area that I'd like to bring in is the global climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. China by far is the biggest emitter year by year of greenhouse gases, and it is catching up even in terms of cumulative emissions to other countries. And as given the size, there will not be a solution to global climate change without China. So this is another example where the risk of not taking action by China is actually far bigger than the risk of taking action. And I know China is doing a lot on renewables. It could do more in terms of offering technology of these renewables to African countries, for example, and enabling them financially to achieve them. China could stop building coal power plants in China and throughout the world. And China could be a lead in setting carbon prices right. As an economist, I can tell you, because there are subsidies on fossil fuels, this is a very bad thing for adjusting to climate change. And there is a need to set the price of carbon emissions right in the world. And China, again, given its size, can play a very leading role. Not exactly answering your question, I realize that, but I wanted to make these points. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think especially the first part of the answer there, you did address it, which is that one of the big barriers is turning these issues into zero-sum games, right? And you use trade as an example there. We've seen this, especially this year since January, but we've seen this tit for tat tariff war, etc. And I'm wondering if you're implying, Dr. Horvath, that there's another path that China could take rather than tit for tat, rather than meeting tariff with tariff. They could perhaps take another path and set an example for taking action in a kind of a more positive light that isn't a race to the bottom, which is what seems to be going on now. I'd be interested to hear Professor Wang's view on that. So, Professor Wang, we see this global tariff war taking place, and most of the time we see countries, including China, saying, well, you hit me with this, I'll hit you with that, right? And this notion that two wrongs makes a right. What's your view? Is China approaching this issue of trade, particularly with the United States, in the right way? Are there alternative ways that China could approach the current issues that it's having around trade?
Okay, we are quite familiar with President Trump because the first term also launched the trade war against China. So this time come back and China fully prepare for that. And Chinese confidence is because China is most independent from the United States. Even though some areas still we say 12 points by the United States, but fundamentally we don't use, for instance, Google, we don't use the Americans. Still we buy federal bonds, but less. So that's reason when the U.S. come back, President Trump come back and launch the trade war, China is not so afraid. And the U.S. cannot get what they want. Why China play the rare earths and other leverage actually is to remind the U.S. back to the normal. Because we support with their free trade, WTO-centric multilateral system. It's not about our bilateral dispute. It's about the order. It's about the UN system. Otherwise, no any other countries can repeat the rise of China's experience. For those who just rely on the trade, will be suffer like another COVID. So in this regard, I think China to remind the U.S. back to with the market principle, economic law, which the United States always teach China about that. When China joined WTO, now the U.S. think about this unfair, this is making China more benefit from the globalization, so they change their mind, they change their mentality. So that's the reason I think we can have maybe more better solution for that, as you mentioned, not just a bilateral dispute.
Thank you, Professor Wang. I'd like to come back now to Ms. Naidu and ask you some of the questions that were on my mind when you were sharing your opening remarks. China's engagement with Africa, it's been a story for some time now. Most of what I'm beaming in from the UK, most of what we read in the news and commentaries on China's engagement with Africa don't come from Africa itself. They usually come from European and American sources. So a two-part question here. Within Africa, and I use that term acknowledging that we cannot lump Africa all as one homogeneous grouping, but when it comes to African perspectives across the continent, and particularly if they're different from country to country, that would be really interesting to hear as well. But when it comes to African perspectives on China's engagement with countries within the continent, what are the prevailing viewpoints and perspectives, and particularly differing perspectives based on countries' level of development, their governance systems, and their kind of other alliances around the world?
I think for me, a big question that it's extrapolated from this conversation and the previous panel is, what are you using mediation for? What's the purpose of mediation, and how you're trying to use mediation for whatever your relationship is with, whether it's the Asia region or it's Africa? And if we bring that down to the point you're making, Karim, about the prevailing issues or the prevailing engagements between African countries and China, I think it's very important to take note of the fact that the relationship China has with Africa as a continent gets very much confused, or it becomes part of this idea that we keep mentioning from an African perspective, that Africa is not a country, it's a continent. And therefore, China's engagement across the continent is very disparate. It's very diffused. I think there are about 4 or 5 countries that really push bigger level of the economic and trade engagement with China. President Ramaphosa, the South African president, keeps mentioning the trade deficit between Africa and China because of the fact that China is actually selling more to the continent continent and to particular countries in the continent, and not buying enough from Africa. And where there is bigger challenges, I think, in terms of the prevailing economic view, is not just the trade deficit, but this question around how do you create access to the Chinese market, as Dr. Horvath was talking about, in terms of the trade issue. How do you create access to the Chinese market, dealing with the structural conditions in the Chinese market around prevailing issues around import taxes, issues around protectionism. And we now see that the Chinese government has opened up this whole aspect of duty-free, market-free access to the Chinese market. But again, we don't know what that entails in terms of the type of goods that will access the Chinese market. So I think from an economic perspective, if we are thinking about the prevailing views, then that's one issue, that not all countries in Africa see China in the same way. They embrace China, or they see China as an important economic partner. Just thinking about the recent engagements that happened at the BRICS Leaders Virtual Summit on Tuesday or Monday this week, where there was a lot of talk about an economic strategy that needs to be developed, because in response to what is becoming the politicization of the trade and tariff issues with regard to the Trump presidency. But when it comes to other aspects around the environmental issue, I think there's still questions around what does this mean in terms of China's footprint in Africa. When it comes to critical minerals, which is a very hot topic right now, and creating that kind of push and pull tension around access to Africa's critical minerals, we speak about the challenges in terms of what is the competition, what is the zero-sum game. So some of the prevailing views, I think, needs to be disaggregated, Karim, around the lines of whether it's a state-to-state led engagement, whether it is around the relationship between activists that are basically pursuing advocacy around environmental issues, questions around the people-to-people engagement, and what does that entail? What does it mean when we speak about the relationship between China at the level of people-to-people, subnational, and also the role of Chinese corporates and Chinese economic migrants who are now in Africa, but at the subnational level. And so there are prevailing views. Some may see it as one that needs to be challenged. There's tensions in the narrative in Africa around whether China is also exploiting the market. And I think these are exploiting different spaces, or are they also causing environmental problems in Africa? So there's different ways in which the narrative comes out. I think from the academic level, where we sit, and the policy think tank level, the question really is about how is Africa shaping its relationship with China, as opposed to how China is shaping its relationship with African countries. And this is where the question around agency becomes critical. But I want to just circle back about a minute to this issue of mediation. We've seen in Africa where China has played a role around mediation. At times, China has tried to bring different parties to a table to negotiate, to look at how it has to deal with this. And one of it is what happened in 2007, 2008, particularly 2008, where China was hosting the 2008 Olympics, and they had created a space, a spectrum, a table where they started to negotiate with different actors, because there was going to be a boycott of this Olympics because of the Sudanese conflict, the Darfur conflict. And it was very important to see how they brought African stakeholders to the table to discuss how to deal with this. But that happened at the state-to-state level and at the academic and policy think tank level. When it came to NGOs, those that were on the ground in Darfur, in Sudan, there was a different interpretation of China, and it became very implosive. It was very confrontational in that way. So I think that in itself also raises the question around how is China dealing with intrastate conflict in Africa, particularly where the conflict is between the state and citizens who have been excluded. The example of Cabo Delgado is one of them. The example of the DRC is another, in terms of Eastern DRC, and of course issues around the critical minerals as well. And these are areas where I think China also gets flustered, if I may use that word, in how to deal with intrastate conflict, because again, the question is who are you negotiating with, and who's excluded from there? Because the question of sovereignty is also critical to the mediation role that China seeks to pursue.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, this intrastate conflict in countries like DRC, do you feel there's an appetite? Is there receptivity to a nation like China coming and creating that platform for intrastate mediation? Or do they want to be left alone and happy to have someone mediate in my relationship with my neighboring countries. But when it comes to within my country, sovereign, it's actually a question. Is the view that it would be impinging on the nation's sovereignty for a country like China to come in and mediate an intrastate conflict?
I think it depends who you speak to. I think if you're talking to state authorities, then of course they welcome any kind of stakeholder who can come in and negotiate and mediate conflict. If I think about South Africa's role in terms of peacekeeping, peace mediation, and brokering, this happened in the DRC, it happened in Sun City very early on in South Africa's post-apartheid democratic state, negotiating these spaces. But again, the challenge, I think, is not necessarily whether you are coming in to help negotiate a peace agreement. The challenge in Africa is that the actors are changing constantly. It's not static. It's very fluid. It's very difficult in a sense because the conflict is becoming even more and more complex and more regional in terms of regional spillovers. And of course, an actor like China, whilst it may want to come in because there are economic interests. In the case of South Sudan, you saw Chinese petroleum company at the time trying to engage in what they call corporate social responsibility, social development, looking at things like economic social governance, architecture, building schools, etc. But it didn't do enough because at the end of the day, the complexity of the interstate conflict in Africa is very difficult to just single out one particular actor and who you're dealing with. So this is what happened this week, last week rather, where the Thabo Mbeki Foundation hosted its second African Peace and Security Dialogue and went back to questions around conflict and peace and security challenges and governance challenges in Africa. So I think China may not want to be seen as impinging on the sovereignty of another country, but the challenge again is at the level of the actors within the state, who's negotiating it. And I think the challenge also is when you look at the regional organizations like your intergovernmental authority like IGAD or the Southern African Development Community, your regional bodies who are supposed to also be part of this, but it creates these contagion effects. So it's a very difficult question to raise. And of course, then you have citizens or you have groups in the intrastate conflict as key actors in the conflict who also are playing a critical role, who are probably speaking to other actors. I give you the example of Qatar right now. Qatar is negotiating for the M23 rebels, which is taking it completely out of comfort zone for the Trump presidency because the Trump presidency claims that it has a peace agreement and a peace deal, but that has been thrown up in terms of what is happening with the M23 rebels and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Naidu. Staying on mediation, because I think this comes up again and again, the premise being that in the fractured world we live in, mediation before litigation, before conflict should always be our priority. So I want to come back to Professor Ali. You know, he's done a lot of work advising, well, mediating disputes around things like the Belt and Road Initiative, advising organizations like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. What are some of the material ways that China approaches these mediation efforts that you think could translate globally as well? What are some of the best practices that you've seen coming out of China's approach to mediation?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there have been some great learning process over the last several decades. I think that there are definitely a commitment to mediation. We saw that with this development of the International Organization for Mediation in Hong Kong, a real commitment to this use of state-to-state or party-to-state discussion forum for resolution. So I think that commitment is definitely there. I think that there is also a growing interest and commitment to working with stakeholders. So a new mechanism was established within China. It's the mechanism for critical minerals. As a sort of community-based system where individuals who are affected by mineral extraction activities can raise concerns and have some direct contacts. I think this is a new area of learning. This is something also China is participating in the International Accountability Mechanisms Network. This is a network of global banking institutions and other actors who are investors in various large-scale projects to share learning about how to engage effectively with communities, as was mentioned with Ms. Naidu, how to really bring these various stakeholders to create shared value, shared discussion, shared conversation about goals. And I think China has an important role in that network, and there is some learning that has advanced. I think there's been significant advancement in the way that this type of conversation, this type of consultation takes place. I think it was very much, say, across the board, not just in China, but any of these development agencies, say 60, 70 years ago, it didn't exist. Then it existed in form, but not in substance. And then increasingly, with so many situations and experiences of pushback, there's a lot of learning about the substance now. And I think that's really important. How do we have effective mediation, consultation, address power imbalance, address issues of voluntariness? This is a global learning process, and I think that there has been genuine efforts, and China has also contributed an important role, an important voice and learning to that conversation. It has been using mediation in some of its AIIB cases. They have Beijing International Commercial Court has used mediation in some commercial disputes, which I think some of those were investments in Africa and other areas. These are sort of off the books. We don't have a lot of records of them, but we understand from a few case studies that there have been, in the commercial context, some very effective mediation processes that have taken place. I think there is a growing interest across the board in mediation at the global level. I think if we look at international conventions and for example, UN Convention on Law of the Sea or Convention on Civil Aviation, all of these call for mediation as a first step, and it's not always successful. I think the success rate is low, but I think the intention there of learning how to do this well is shared, and I think China has a very important experience to share in that conversation.
Thanks, Professor Ali. You mentioned inclusivity there, and Ms. Naidu in her previous remarks was talking about around the 2008 Olympics, China bringing many African leaders, around the table and other parties, but at that time, not including the NGO community, and that led to some criticism of the process and maybe a bit of a backlash. Professor Wang, I would love to hear your thoughts on if and how that's changing when it comes to Chinese approaches to mediation and to those mediation processes being as inclusive as possible, bringing as many different actors to the table. I mean, harmony, you've talked about as being really a key value within Chinese culture, and harmony is difficult to achieve if certain parties are excluded from the conversation. So do you feel this is something that China is being proactive around, trying to be more inclusive as it approaches its potential role as a mediator?
There is a hot debate in China, actually, about whether China should change the policy of non-interfering domestic affairs. As a principle, as a tradition, we do not change and will not change. But how to define pure domestic affairs? For instance, North Korea go to nuclear weapons. This is against the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So according to the UN, China also joined the sanctions to North Korea before. So this is not pure domestic affairs. About the mediation, I think that there are three principles for China still keep that. The number one, mediation means you are not join one side against another side. You should keep distance with them. And secondly, you cannot pour the oil in the fire. So you should calm down the situation and make them to provide more platforms for them to negotiate. And thirdly, I think the mediation should under the leadership of the UN. Either we send the peacekeepers, and also if there's a UN resolution with demand by the sovereign state or like African Union, Arabic Union. So that's the reason every time when China hosts like recently the SCO summit and plus, we also invite the rotating presidency of ASEAN, for instance, now Malaysia, and also the rotating presidency of the African Union, Arabic Union. So it'd be the global gathering in this regard. So mediation, again, is like the traditional Chinese medicine, not to avoid spillover effect. We say harmony is because they are all, we say, equal life. You should keep the harmonious coexistence, not just peacefully, but also harmoniously. And then any mediation can be sustainable, not to harm to them, either currently or in the long term. So that's basically, we still try to learn from other countries as well, how to mediate, but in their way they can accept. But most importantly, any mediation should be invited by both conflict side, not just one side, and accepted by all, if you make a decision, and under the leadership of either local, regional organization or United Nations.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Dr. Horvath, I'd like to come back to you. And after this question, I think I'm going to invite a round of kind of final reflections from each of you, maybe another couple of minute statements just to share if there are certain views, opinions you wanted to get across and haven't yet had a chance. But before I do that, Dr. Horvath, you've worked with the UNDP for many years and in several African countries as well, South Sudan, Botswana. And in your view, and this isn't just about China, but any international actor coming into a country to either mediate or to engage, to support growth and infrastructure development, etc. How do those countries ensure that they don't, to what Professor Wang was saying, create more spillover effects, be that political instability, dependency, going into financial debt that is unserviceable? So what are your views on some of the measures that the international community should take when supporting growth, development in developing countries?
Thank you for the question. And I think Professor Wang has gone a very long way in laying out a couple of key concepts. Go in with humility. You're not the wisest person on earth, and you know far less about the specific situation in that country, in the African country, than the people living there. You can bring advantages by being an outsider, by not having vested interests, but do that with humility and work with the people there. They will give you the solution. They know the solution. They are stuck in a suboptimal equilibrium. You will not be able to teach them that, hey, you never understood the real life. This is how it is. Instead, you are going to be able to work with them. If you're lucky to gain their trust and then say, hey, my interest as the UN or as an outside mediator is to find a solution that is best for everyone, and not only in the short run, but in the long term. And if you manage to gain the trust of the local actors, and if conflict has reached a stage where they have reached a stage where said anything but this, and there is always a part, there is always a stage when the majority reaches that stage, then you have a hope. And then if you approach this with humility, you can actually contribute. You're not the one to solve the problems. It is always going to be the local people, but you can contribute to it. You asked for closing remarks. Can I just quickly say something?
Yes, please, go ahead.
What I get from this discussion, and it has been really a very rich discussion, is that a couple of things are converging. Obviously, China is a huge country and it has grown tremendously, so it has a lot to offer in terms of its experience. The world is now in an era of contested multipolarity. There is a growing chorus of countries or leaders who are talking with a zero-sum approach, and that poses a very, very big risk. And I would join Professor Ali in saying that China can positively contribute to a global learning process. Again, not China coming in and say, I knew it all along, this is how you should do it. Instead, contribute because of its weight, because of its history, to a global learning process on how we can move away from the zero-sum equilibrium, which is bad for everyone. And the UN, multilateral agencies, and regional organizations can and need to play a significant role in this. And the one final point where I would like to come back to something Professor Wang has mentioned, global public goods are typically areas where they can contribute. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Horvath. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to ask Ms. Naidu to share your closing reflections. And you don't need to keep it too short. You got a couple of minutes, don't worry.
Thank you. I think for me, one of the bigger challenges or one of the bigger questions that come up from the African context, and that is how the African landscape is changing rapidly. the set of structural conditions, both political, economic, but in terms of developmental challenges in the continent is really becoming more and more prominent in terms of intra-state conflict, which is then having a regional spillover in terms of instability that is now being also facilitated not just by issues with regard to intrastate conflict between different stakeholders, but it's also around the environmental challenges, around climate refugees and so forth. And that's creating a lot of interesting but very disparate and debilitating tensions in the continent. And so for actors like China, as well as other actors, the complexity of the African continent is also a reflection of the complexity of the global system. And that complexity means that you have to start thinking about the fact that you have not just one set of actors that are now playing or being defined in the African context. You have a whole multitude of actors that are competing in the space of mediation, in the space of peace brokering, but also in the space of economic transactions. And so in that context, I think it's going to be quite interesting for me to see, for example, beyond the UN, how does China and its relationships that it has in the BRICS, in the SCO, etc., that deal with these issues, which there are countries like Iran, there are countries like Qatar, UAE, etc., that are playing a very prominent role in Africa's development, but not necessarily in the way that we see the development becoming inclusive. So the exclusive issues around communities that are excluded from the kind of development paradigms that are not taking place in Africa is leading to conflict. But then the challenge for actors, external actors, is we're in a constant kind of vicious cycle because you're not dealing with the same set of stakeholders. It's all changing very rapidly. And the actors that are competing in terms of the competitive rivalries in Africa is becoming much more difficult for actors like China to continue to remain with the level of who is at the state level and are they really legitimately representing the interests of citizens in Africa. So I think for me, that complexity at the subnational level has percolated to the global level. And one of the bigger challenges we're going to have in Africa is as urbanization becomes almost 70% by 2040 or even faster, we're going to have more and more issues of interstate conflict because you're going to have urban sprawl. And I think that's the big security challenge that not just China, but every external actor, including those that are in the continent, are going to face in terms of how to deal with this rapid urbanization in Africa, which is becoming a security dilemma for us.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Naidu. Your passion's coming through the screen. Yeah, really, really thank you for those remarks. Professor Wang, could I ask you for some short closing remarks as well?
We learn from the motto of Nelson Mandela, of the Wu Bantu, I am because we are. So that thing is a shared feature, definitely. So before we emphasize the Confucian's motto, so to undo to others, because you want to undo to you. But now you and others, actually, they're shared future. We are in a global village, either climate change or AI or economically, culturally. So in this regard, I think we should have a more real global thinking or global thinking to any intervention as a partner to learning to do that, as Ali said. So I hope the world will come to a new stage or a new paradigm of the civilization, not to repeat neutrality, great power politics in history. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Where else can you hear a leading Chinese professor evoking the spirit of Ubuntu? I really, really love that. And last but not least, Professor Ali, before we hand back to Rebecca, your closing remarks.
Thank you so much. I very much agree and appreciate all the comments, and I think I've learned a great deal. I think China, one of the qualities I've understood and come to appreciate in my friendships with friends of Chinese origin and spending years there, is this truth-seeking nature. It is truth-seeking, and I think you can really see that in the way it's engaging. And I think it has a real opportunity to look beyond some of these old paradigms of realpolitik, zero-sum thinking, which has shaped global organization of relationships, which tend to create insecurity and suspicion, these formations of bloc, to really move out of that and elevate this conversation beyond this playground approach of tit for tat to something else, which I think is what's needed. And if I may, I'd like to just share something encouraging, which was also written this early 1900s. It says that, and I think it echoes Professor Wong, what he was describing about this concept of the body and this body of humanity. And it says that this limitless universe is like the human body, and all the members of which are connected and linked with one another in the greatest strength. And I think so this concept that all the nations, all the people are connected in this great strength, that's something that we need to see how we can move forward. And I think China is in a great position with its truth-seeking orientation to really think how to have this elevated conversation that will bring us out of some of the spirals that we exist in at the present time.
Thank you, Professor Ali. Yeah, on behalf of myself, everyone who's tuned in today, and GIFT, I really want to thank all of our panelists, Professor Ali, Professor Wang, Ms. Naidu, and Dr. Horvath, for this elevated conversation. Yeah, what a great way. I'm in Europe, so it's still the beginning of the day. I can ride on this for the rest of the day. A wonderful way to start the morning.